It falls to me to have the pleasure of welcoming you all. I was going to say something like ladies and gentlemen, but I can see it should be just old friends and hopefully some new ones as well. So it is fun to me to introduce this very interesting program of poetry. It's unusual, I have to say, that it is devised entirely by Hilde Weissert and assembled by her. The poetry has been assembled by her, and the people who are going to read them have been invited by Hilde. So this is very much her program, and a fascinating one at that. So, here we go. Words, words, and words. What else? When men are dead, their small lives ended, and their saying said is left of them. A very provocative beginning to a poem by Witter Binner, of whom you will hear later. So this is what Hilde, I'm reading Hilde's introduction to this program because she is far more eloquent than I could possibly be. Today's program will take you on a journey from the past to today. Let you feel what binds us across all ages, space, and time, and that is continuity. This continuity is imagination itself, the poetic line passing from one poet and century to another, but changed as later poets find in the dialogue ways to address new problems. The creative act manifest in poems you will hear today, bringing old wars into today, brings alive beauty and the consolations of nature itself, as well as its power and its vulnerabilities, the connections and disconnections of family, and the continuity of life even as we age and die. You'll hear all these connections through the voices of the award-winning poets here today. We have, I'll just go along the line. It is James Kraft, and then Jane Ben-Julian, Rebecca Hart-Olander, Irene Willis, and Hilde herself. And then, to help us out with this, Hilde wanted to involve the Sandisfield players, and there's Marianne Grammer, Jean Atwater-Williams, Tina Sotis, Val Coleman, and myself. And basically, our task will be to read some of the original poems which have inspired the poems from our poets here. So Hilde's gone on to say, what we hope you will find in today's program is the grand line of poetry across generations. Reputations large and small, timeless and momentary. And this is the conversation that Richard Wilbur spoke of in this following quote. A large number of poems I most admire, and which seem to be most original, are talking back to other poets of other ages. And so I'll turn you over to Hilde.
So a big part of what makes good poetry is connection, and especially unexpected connections that, when they are made, are true and ring true and show us something new in something we thought we understood. You're going to hear a lot of that today in terms of different ways of making connections. That we wind up with a sense of surprise and delight and recognition. This can also happen in real life, and did to me recently. So some years ago, I was reading essays by Richard Wilbur, a poet that many of you know, who was a neighbor of ours in Cummington and at Wesleyan for many years, and died in 2017. And in the book of Wilbur, of his essays, was an essay about a poet named Witter Binner. Well, whoever heard of Witter Binner? You will learn a little more about that today. But it intrigued me because he talked about these wonderful things in this poet that was totally forgotten. And so I went and I ordered Widder-Binner's selected poems from A Books because it came out in the 70s. And I got some more Binner books. And then, as I was planning this event and thinking about it, I looked at the book and I thought, the general editor is somebody named James Kraft. Could that person possibly be somebody I could find? And how could I possibly find him? And so I Googled, and I discovered that there was a James Kraft who was giving classes for Ollie in poetry. And then I discovered that there was a James Kraft who had been written about by Irene Willis, a friend of mine from New Jersey 25 years ago at the Geraldine Dodge Foundation stuff. So Irene, Wilbur to Binner to Kraft, somewhere to Willis, and I emailed Irene. And Irene said, he lives a few doors down from me in Lenox. And so, it is my pleasure to introduce James Kraft, who is the series editor of the 5 or 7 books, 5 books of Widder-Binner, a graduate of Princeton, a student of King's College, taught at UVA, University Laval in Quebec, taught at Wesleyan for many years, which is part of what brings you here today because of the connections with Binner and Wilbur and William J. Smith. 8 years at the Whitney. There is no art form that James has not been involved with. 5 years at the Manhattan School. Involved with 2 Chinese translations that Binner did. He teaches today at Ollie and widely around the area. He did a Binner lecture in Cornwall, but it was the other Cornwall in New Hampshire. I thought we had a connection there. And so, James, I will turn it over to you.
With my pleasure. I was walking one day on the campus at Wesleyan, and Paul Horgan, a novelist and historian, came up to me and said, out of the blue, would you like to edit Widder-Binner's letters? And I replied, who is Widder-Binner? Now, this was the man who had been to Princeton, to King's College, Cambridge, had a PhD from Fordham, and I'd never, ever come across him. It turns out he's born in Brooklyn. His father disappears, so his mother moves to Boston, where her sisters are. And Binner is raised in Boston, goes to Harvard, graduates, goes to work in Cornish, New Hampshire, at the estate of Augustus St. Gaudens, and writes some very important letters about the end of St. Gaudens' life. He then decides what to do. He goes to New York and works at McClure's magazine. If that is a name like Widder-Binner, which you don't know probably, but at one point it was the most important magazine in the country and had great exposés of corrupt everything, especially businessmen. So they would have had a wonderful time if they'd been alive today. That was, one bit of sort of being involved in New York. He worked for a small publishing house and published the first book of Ezra Pound's poetry. And he introduced to Knopf Cahill Gabron. Now, this is important only in the sense that Cahill Gabron became the major provider of the funds that Knopf spent to publish all those good European books. and good American ones. And he was for years and years the sort of money font for this entire publishing house. And Binner finally went around the country. He was involved in the founding of Poetry magazine. He and Arthur Davison Ficke, another poet in this area, did a hoax, which was very famous, called Spectrum, about where they wrote like Amy Lowell and other people like that. And everybody bought the poems and thought that they were... And he, in his touring around, he ended up in Santa Fe one time and liked it very much. Bought a mud hut, which became a 17-room mansion, but all mud, I might add. Mud in Santa Fe is a distinction, as you probably know. And lived the rest of his life there. He lived with a much younger man from Los Angeles, and was very close, kind of two-male relationship that was much more what is happening today than what was happening at that particular time. And he had a long period of being involved in Chapala, Mexico, and wrote a lot of poetry about it. And did 2 translations from the Chinese, one of the Tong poems, which is the standard anthology of Chinese Tong poetry. And Tong poetry is supposed to be the best period. And the people that he was interested in were mostly from that group of poets. So all of this is a very exciting background for me to have discovered when I knew absolutely nothing about it. And I'm hoping to share a little bit. I fortunately was warned by my friends who please understand that not everybody in the world was as interested in Witter Binner as you are. And please not to talk too much about him, you know. And I said, well, can I talk a little bit? And he said, a little bit for you will be too much. But anyway, I will be glad to talk to you about any kind of questions. But let's move to some of this. But let me just say before we do, are there anything that I just said to you that you want to question? Well, maybe at another point. Late in his life, Binner began to write lovely little poems, short little poems, and I thought it was very interesting that Dick Wilbur also started to do it. And in fact, I went to him with a poem that he had published in the New Yorker. And I said, Dick, this is very like Witter Binner. And he said, yes. And of course, that was about what we're here today about, that it was. And this is the dimension here, you sense at once. Winter uncovers distances, I find. And so the cold, and so the wintry mind takes leaves away, till there is left behind a wide, cold world. And so the heart grows blind to the earth's green motions lying warm below, field upon field, field upon field of snow. It's a nice little poem, and of course, it's all about the heart and about the things we do. Here's one that I like, because it's called The Dead Loon. There is a dead loon in the camp tonight, killed by a clever fool. And down the lake, a live loon calling. The wind comes stealing tall, muscular, and cool from the plunge where stars are falling. The wind comes creeping, stalking on its night-hidden trail, up to the cabin where we are playing cards and talking, and only I of them all listens and grows pale. He glues his face to the window, addressing only me, talks to me of death, and bids me hark to the foul scream of a loon, and bids me see the face of a clever fool reflected in the dark. That loon is farther on the way than we are. It has no voice with which to answer while we wait, but it is with me and with the evening star. Its voice is my voice, and its fate my fate. Dinner after the publishing several different kinds of poems, did a whole book of sonnets. And that was after the Tuckerman engagement, where most of the Tuckerman is sonnets. And he did a group of 70 sonnets, each of which was based on a separate individual whom he knew, although they weren't named, and you wouldn't know that if you noted. And I picked up some thoughts about some of that, and here's what I did. The essential thing is to love well and live so that we are loved by those important to us. The thought is not mine, but whose? Who has said this before? Why does it seem so familiar, so significant? I would not call it commonplace, because what we know and do not understand, accept and do not live is not commonplace, obvious or expected, easily taken in, make one's own. We searched for the moment we heard these words, this persistent thought, and we cannot remember who said it or when. Not even finally what it means to us. It only seems familiar and significant, like the taste of orange. I love that poem for that last line. It throws the whole poem, which, and what I was trying to do was this statement that was rather commonplace, to investigate it and open it up and then end it with something that shows how the imagination is more real than the real, but that he's using the real to do it. And I want to move quickly so we don't occupy too much of the time here. Give you one Chinese translation. It's called A Farewell to a Friend. With a blue line of mountains north of the wall, and the cast of the city, a white curve of water. Here you must leave me and drift away, like a loosened water plant, hundreds of miles. I shall think of you in a floating cloud. So in the sunset, think of me. We wave our hands to say goodbye, and my horse is neighing again and again. It's a lovely poem, I think, about the saying of goodbye. One of my favorite poems is Driftwood, and I'll only read it if we get later on. I don't want to occupy you, but I do want to. Of course I want to occupy you, that's ridiculous. I'd like to stop everybody else and send them out of the room, and I'll just continue.
Next time, James, next time.
This is a poem that is going to intrigue you. It was published in all kinds of magazines, attributed to Winter, but, and I'll tell you what that but is. It's called Defeat. On a train in Texas, German prisoners eat with white American soldiers, seat by seats, while black American soldiers sit apart, the white man eating meat, the black man heart. Now, with that other war a century done, not the live North, but the dead South has won. Not yet a riven nation comes awake. Whom are we fighting this time, for God's sake? Mark well the token of the separate seats. It is again ourselves whom we defeat. Good. Taking a subject like that and holding it in. And the point I wanted to make about it was so convincing that almost every black publication published it and attributed it to being written by a black man.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the meeting of a whole nother issue of racism as we move into it. Yes?
When was it written?
Well, right at the end or after the Second World War. I can't give you the exact date. Okay?
Thank you.
Well, now I have to give up.
To me.
Everybody else is really boring.
Next time, James. Next time. But imagine out of nowhere, here was this man who wrote these poems, and that poem that could have been written yesterday.
Yes.
That could have been written yesterday. And so this leads us to, then there are topics in your program, war and suffering, an important poetic theme, and a poem of my own called Finding Wilfred Owen Again. And there are times when something such as the Iraq War is going on and you don't know where to turn. And so I turned to Wilfred Owen. Our college love affair was doomed, like all the romance I outgrew at 20. Trench warfare's mad embrace be damned, along with Buffy St. Marie and Nietzsche. And anyway, the war in Vietnam was ending. For decades, he lay silent in a book, moved from Brooklyn to St. Louis and LA, with curling snapshots, silver rings turned black. The mildewed albums I will never play. I left him to his war. Our war had ended. Until I call the offhand way you do old flames, as if you hadn't kept their trail of numbers. When something big has changed or Armageddon looms. Shamed moment, was it Rupert I remembered? Romance imagined? Not now. War has descended, distant and mine. I'm dazed, feckless, as lost as my lost country. So I come here to find myself standing on shattered ground he blessed with full eyes 90 years ago, and hear him tell another time how war must end in this fell field, on this dark page. The night opens, closes, opens, a swinging sulfur rhythm in the flare, igniting each line end. The face is lit and then eclipsed, but always bright the names.
Beautiful.
Ben.
So, just as, it's interesting because just as Hildy carried her volume of Wilfred Owen around with her for maybe, is it 3 or 4 decades, so Wilfred Owen himself was also totally ignored for the best part of 5 decades. And it was, except for maybe some cognoscenti that were very interested in the First World War poets. But he was rediscovered after the Second World War. And he was rediscovered by Benjamin Britten. When Britten was commissioned to write the War Requiem, I think one of his various greatest compositions for the rebuilding of Coventry Cathedral, which had been bombed and destroyed during that Second World War. And so Britain chose to set a requiem mass for the dead, and into that mass he inserted poems, settings of the poems of Wilfred Owen. And it is just the most, it's incredible, innovative idea, and there it was. Suddenly everyone, Wilfred Owen was back in the world of literature where he should have been since 1918 when he died. So I'm going to read you two short poems of Wilfred Owen. They're not the graphic poems that he wrote describing the lives and the deaths and the agonies of those trench warfare in those 4 years. These are rather different. The first one is called Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the gun. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them off? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each low dusk a drawing down of blinds. And the second poem, equally short, is much more personal. That is a very general poem. This is very personal. It is called Futility. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once. At home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs, so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Or what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? And from war, I suppose, we move to suffering. And now I have to say that a friend of ours is suffering at the moment. He should have been here. Charles Fiddler is one of our group of players, a very prominent member among us, and wanted very desperately to be a part of this program, but I'm afraid he's running a temperature and can't join us. So I'm reading the poem, which he would have read now. And this is an Auden poem called Musée des Beaux-Arts. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not especially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even dreadful martyrdom must run its course, anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate shiplet must have seen something amazing. A boy falling out of the sky had somewhere to go to, and sailed calmly on.
William Carlos Williams. Okay. William Carlos Williams. According to Bruegel, when Icarus fell, it was spring. A farmer was plowing his field, and the whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling near the edge of the sea, concerned with itself, sweating in the sun that melted the wings wax. Unsignificantly off the coast, there was a splash, quite unnoticed, and this was Icarus drowning.
And if you look at the cover of your program, there's a small version of the picture that both Auden and William Carlos Williams are talking about. And I don't think they were in conversation with each other because they were so different. We don't want to say that they, which one knew about the other, but if you look to the far right, you may see little legs going into the sea. And that's a famous picture for the reason of the doggy scratching its behind and life going on. And it was something I turned to when seemed to be affected by war, but there have been enough of them for us. There are two New York Times war photographers, Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington, and you can look them up. They were so talented, and they did these gorgeous pictures of war. They were both killed while on assignment in Misrata, Libya, in April 2011. Jane.
This is The News Photographers by Hildy Weissert. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. And the young and not so young photographers are not either. Taking pictures in biblical lands of Old Testament scenes wired home for our breakfast. The photographs, as old and luminous as paintings, the figures sacred and brushed in oil. Here, a prophet raises a broken child like a lamb to be laid on a rock. Here, a father stands forsaken by God, his eyes on ours. And there behind, a fading smear of camo and a white face. Out of our range, a cool professional kneels in dust to hold the frame still, click after click. The human position in Gaza, Libya, Afghanistan. Taking in the beauty of the Rembrandt shades, I am ashamed to be seeing this as art, values of light and dark, masked shapes, tones. But it is art, and what Auden commends, the timeless truth the masters understood, the photographers know too. Their work is a picture in a newspaper, a day we cannot help but turn away from when the next day comes. But they know more, our artists of the camera. They must. When it is they who see framing this world in their hands, and they as well who fall.
asked me to talk a little bit about myth as a prelude to the next two poems that I'm going to read, one by Van Boland and one that I've written. What I find compelling about myth is that we can hold up these characters who are removed from us by millennia and examine their behavior, sometimes their horrible behavior, or their generous behavior. And we can hold these figures up and turn them around. And I like to do that, and I find that they are great commentary on family and on relationships of humans. And I quite agree with the poet Van Boland, who opens the poem I'm going to read by saying, "The only legend I have ever loved is the story of a daughter lost in hell." She's referring to the myth of Ceres and Persephone, or some of us know it as Demeter and Persephone, Demeter being the Greek name and Ceres the Roman name. And you may be familiar with the abduction of Persephone, the daughter of Demeter. Demeter was the sibling, actually, of Hades, the god of the underworld. Hades fell in love with Demeter, or Ceres' daughter, Persephone, and he brought his chariot and 4 horses up through the center of the earth split, and he stole Persephone from Ceres and took her down to the underworld. And so Ceres was in hysterical grief, could not get over the loss of her daughter, and she appealed to Zeus, who agreed to send Persephone back to Ceres. But Persephone had eaten a few seeds of the pomegranate in Hades. And because she had eaten a few seeds, some say 1, some say 4, some say 6, of the pomegranate, she could not remain with her mother on earth forever. So the deal was that Zeus was the arbiter for, was that she would rise and come back to earth to be with Ceres, and that she would have to descend for part of the year to remain in Hades. And that part of the year when she was gone was the part of the year that Ceres mourned for her, grieved for her, and that was the winter, when Ceres, who was the guard of the harvest, would allow nothing to grow and everything to die. So that's the basic myth with, of course, variations. That myth speaks to me the way it does to Van Boland, allowing me to kind of hold up my life and turn it around. And what is so intriguing to me about the poem Boland writes is that she is, in the poem, both Ceres and Persephone, because, of course, as women, we are daughters and mothers both. So this is The Pomegranate by Van Boland. The only legend I have ever loved is the story of a daughter lost in hell and found and rescued there. Love and blackmail are the gist of it. Ceres and Persephone the names. And the best thing about the legend is I can enter it anywhere, and have. As a child in exile in a city of fogs and strange consonants, I read it first, and at first I was an exiled child in the crackling dusk of the underworld, the stars blighted. Later I walked out in a summer twilight, searching for my daughter at bedtime. When she came running, I was ready to make any bargain to keep her. I carried her back past white beams and wasps and honey-scented budleias. But I was Ceres then, and I knew winter was in store for every leaf on every tree on that road, was inescapable for each one we passed, and for me. It is winter, and the stars are hidden. I climb the stairs and stand where I can see my child asleep. Beside her teen magazines, her can of Coke, her plate of uncut fruit, the pomegranate. How did I forget it? She could have come home and been safe and ended the story in all our heartbroken searching. But she reached out a hand and plucked a pomegranate. She put out her hand and pulled down the French sound for apple and the noise of stone and the proof that even in the place of death, at the heart of legend in the midst of rocks full of unshed tears, ready to be diamonds by the time the story was told, a child can be hungry. I could warn her, there is still a chance. The rain is cold. The road is flint-colored. The suburb has cars and cable television. The veiled stars are above ground. It's another world, but what else can a mother give her daughter but such beautiful rifts in time? If I defer the grief, I will diminish the gift. The legend will be hers as well as mine. She will enter it as I have. She will wake up. She will hold the papery flushed skin in her hand, and to her lips I will say nothing. That poem bears 3 or 4 readings, so I'll leave you to it. And this is the poem that Boland inspired that I wrote. It's called Winter. We have left you certain things in a safety deposit box. Diamond earrings, birth records, letter on pink stationery. From the back seat of a taxi, I watched you knock on the screen door, disappear into a pair of arms. These are your parents. You have his beanpole shape. They were gangly teenagers too. For me, it was 2 hours in the liquor store or Dunkin' Donuts. Outside, stoplights, green, yellow, endless returning. I held on to one poor cup of coffee. You emerged clutching a blood-red rose. A blizzard of turnstiles. Nothing could persuade you to let that flower go until, weary, running for the last train, you released it to me. 1,000 petals floated to the floor. In that volcanic silence of the ruined rose, I stole you from them. One single season, I allow you to ascend.
And now on to James Tuckerman.
You want me to do the Tuckerman? Therefore I wept tonight.
The line?
When quick words rose out of the dead man's grave, whom no one knows. Binner discovered the unpublished poems of Frederick Goddard Tuckerman and edited them in 1931. And although the unknown poet in the poem might be Tuckerman, we're not sure that it is. But it is true that Binner's next book was a tour de force of 70 sonnets, as so many of Tuckerman's were sonnets. Binner wrote the introduction to the collected poems of Tuckerman, where he and the austere melancholy which dominates the sonnets is tempered throughout with his sense of material beauty, which heals even as it wounds.
So Tuckerman, that David is knowledgeable about, or you said something about Tuckerman when you came here. Tuckerman lived in
There's
Greenfield.
a wonderful poem, The Cricket, I think is his best poem, but that's why they're out there now.
So the discovery, so it was for me, in another Winter-Binner volume, the prose pieces, that I find an essay by Binner introducing, and James read from it, introducing the collected poems of Tuckerman that Binner had revived. So you have these poets reviving other poets. And Binner was frank about Tuckerman. He said, there was a lot of his poetry that wasn't that good, but then there were, well, he said, all in all, if my judgment is in any way sound, Tuckerman's sonnets rank with the noblest in the language and dignify America with poems not bettered by their kind by anyone of his time or since. Well, poets come and go. But let me read you just a few fragments from Tuckerman. Now think of this being written in, I guess, sometime in the middle of the 19th century, probably around the Civil War. America, the country of the world, the half the world that should have changed the whole, the model flowering of all modern time, dropping to pieces like a 3-day rose. So that was about the Civil War, probably. And just another stanza. When either his daughter or his wife died, one or the other he was grieving for. And he says, I took from its glass a flower to lay on her grave with dull, accusing tears, but the heart of the flower fell out as I handled the rose, and my heart is shattered and soon will wither away. I watched the changing shadows and the patch of windy sunshine upon the hill and the long blue woods, and a grief no tongue can tell breaks at my eyes in drops of bitter rain. I read, and this is the last thing I will read, and then lead into Rebecca and that tower that's up there that's connected with Tuckerman. A poem about this whole discovery process and the coming and going of fame and reputation. Tuckerman, the line. Tuckerman was Binner's Binner, his decade deep in another time. I find Binner finding him, the reading mind and the writing by one candle. The page keeps a sitting room, a wood. The line leaps again. That century is far, but the same day, the very hour, a bright circle on each solitary leaf. Tuckerman is minor, some sonnets and an odd line, but in it Binner's joy and mine. His hands hold tender, inconsolable loss in a way that says it is not only his. Oh, Binner, may I call you Binner? What breaks at my eyes, not the steep sun nor wind, but the mind that reckoned this line, the beat of knowing, and the finding second.
Beautiful. So Hildy and I found each other at a reading for a book that you'll see on a table downstairs. It's called Compass Roads, and it's a collection of poems written about areas in our communities. So I had written the following poem, which was in that book. It's called Plein Air. And the poem was sparked by a visit I took to the Poet's Seat, which is that tower in the photo behind us. It's commemorating poet Frederick Goddard Tuckerman, and my poem is about generally what lasts and who listens and how we try to make our mark. And so that, I feel like that kind of, this whole day is about the marks that we leave and how they resonate and follow like a thread through time, through poetry. I wanted to make a little mention at the beginning of the poem. So I'm sitting on top of the Poet's Seat, or beside the Poet's Seat tower with my husband on a bench, and I noticed some, and I notice in the poem a little piece of graffiti written on the bench that says Enzo. So someone's been there and put his name down in Sharpie. And I, in the end of the poem, return to Enzo and like to imagine, I was there thinking about Frederick Goddard Tuckerman and being a poet of this area and having come and made his mark in literature, and I thought Enzo was making his own sort of mark in a way on the bench. And so there's also an epigraph at the beginning that is written by Edmund Wilson, and it brings up Emily Dickinson and Tuckerman. So that is Tuckerman's occasional obscurity, like that of Emily Dickinson, contributes to one's general impression of a soliloquy not quite overheard. So Edmund Wilson was contending that Tuckerman was a little obscure. And so it's this idea of a soliloquy not overheard that I also was playing with in the poem, because we have a woman in this poem who's sort of giving a soliloquy to her boyfriend. So this is called Plein Air. Tuckerman's occasional obscurity, like that of Emily Dickinson, contributes to one's general impression of a soliloquy not quite overheard. On the bluff astride the Poet's Seat tower, overlooking Greenfield, from a faded gray bench inscribed with Enzo blocked out in Sharpie, I hear a muffled peal of bells, intermittent dog barks, distant shouts of children, the rush and rev of vehicles as they pass and follow down on Highway 91. My husband sketches next to me, and on another bench, a couple slurps from big gulps, reaching over and over into a shared bag of fries. Their conversation joins the birds, the scratch of charcoal pencil, and the high-pitched whine of air conditioners from the hospital below, purring in unison like lovelorn cicadas. I steal glances at the strappy stilettos of the woman on the other bench. With her cigarette, she points out childhood haunts to her boyfriend, the white house at the crossroads where she bought her first smokes, her school, her church. She doesn't say whether the bells came from her congregation, tolling at 6 o'clock on the Saturday night, the sun still high in the July sky. She tells him, I don't even know why it's called Poet's Seat, as if history is no longer than her life. And she climbed this mountain without reading the plaque commemorating Frederick Goddard Tuckerman, the solitary poet read by Emerson, Hawthorne, and Tennyson, who came here long before us, schooled in these same trees, these same rocks. The ground is littered with butts, so it's not hard to guess what Enzo did when he was here. Under the bench, a black smudge from an obliterated cigarette looks like the charcoal my husband rubs across a page to give it depth and character. The couple walks away, tossing leftover fries to the birds, leaving us with Enzo's ghost, his little sister's juice box, the sumac bouquet she picked, the brown shards she collected as if beachcombing while Enzo made his mark. First in dots of unraised braille, then connecting the circles like a voting ballot, electing Enzo king of the mountain, poet of the peak, from up here, larger than interstates, taller than steeples, than any roof in town. He could see the octagons of stop signs, where fences began and ended. Maybe he lit a last smoke off the one before, pulled his sister away before she cut herself, made her leave her findings on the stones. Dark by then, the tip of his smoke a tiny flashlight, leading them down the mountain, descending back to scale.
I dwell in possibility, Emily Dickinson. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky, of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise.
Thank you. So I get to read again. Thank you so much. That was Emily Dickinson's, the first line is I dwell in possibility, and my poem is called Grounds of Memory Tour at the Homestead. So being from this area, I think most of you, perhaps many of you have been to Emily Dickinson's home and the museum, and there's a tour called the Grounds of Memory Tour. So I took that. I've been on all the different tours there, and I'm a friend of the museum. I love it there. Just last night, I learned that the actual real dress of Emily Dickinson lives in the Amherst Historical Society, and that the one there in the museum is a replica, which I did not know. So just a little tidbit there, an aside. So this poem, it was hard for me to pick which poem to pair in the program for my poem, because my poem is a little bit of a collage of Emily Dickinson poems. So if you know her work, you'll, as you listen to my poem, you'll hear a reference to a clover and a bee, and there's a poem of hers that begins to make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. And there's another poem of hers that has the line, the brain is wider than the sky. And so you'll hear something in my poem, if poetry's wider than today, is my line. And so let's see, what else? Her dog Carlo shows up in my poem. I'm thinking about the meadow and a train station that's across the street, and her herbarium at her home. So this is called Grounds of Memory Tour at the Homestead. I feel no pull to save this in a herbarium, to press these flowers into servicing memory. I dwell in reality and cannot see away the main road, the cars rushing past, and other visitors holding wands to their ears while a Dickinson stand-in whispers passages. The painters on their ladders sprucing the house next door, their talk of brews at Puffer's Pond, blown radiators, the awful boss, and when he'll stop by, I can't erase, can't get back to Emily's meadow, the train in its stable just beyond the tall grass, the single bee, the clover, her big dog Carlo bounding up the slope. But if poetry's wider than today, maybe I'm already there. The hooting stanza heard, the pollen-packed panniers buzz, my own second life, pinned on the page beside its Latin name, anima.
So we're in the land of spirit, of what individual thought, of wanting answers. And there's a lesser-known poem now by Robert Frost called The Most of It. He thought he kept the universe alone, for all the voice in answer he could wake was but the mocking echo of his own from some tree-hidden creek across the lake. Some morning from the boulder-broken beach he would cry out on life that what it wants is not its own love back in cocky speech, but counter-love, original response. And nothing ever came of what he cried, unless it was the embodiment that crashed in the cliff's talus on the other side, and then in the far distant water splashed. But after a time allowed for it to swim, instead of proving human when it neared and someone else additional to him, as a great buck, it powerfully appeared, pushing the crumpled water up ahead and landed pouring like a waterfall and stumble through the rocks with horny tread and force the underbrush. And that was all.
The pity of it, by Hildy Weiser, after Robert Frost's The Most of It. Towering on tinker-toyed legs, a giant moose looms suddenly on the path ahead. Whose cry? And what universe answers with a cartoon embodiment of old wild hope, all high legs and head, God's own, this? As alien from me as my own heart, but perfect. My heart echoes in the woods, jackrabbit. I inhale what rises off the forest floor, the spore part her, what pours off me. Only this morning I heard we are killing them. Not we, but what we do. A degree or two of human warming changing their world. The cows too far for me to see the lush black undercoat of winter ticks bedded in the shaggy hair, the hungry lives out of season, living on past fall to sicken moose. But what I cannot see, my hands strive to touch, trace her flank, the beating chest, dig out the burrowing scores. Only the least of it, dear ragged cow. Regal, she collects herself and stumbles off, ghostly, gray beast.
And that brings us into mortality and aging and carrying on in spite of it all. And Jean.
All right. So this is from Sylvia Plath, Among the Narcissi. Spry, wry, and grey as these March sticks, Percy bows in his blue pea jacket among the narcissi. He is recuperating from something on the lawn. The narcissi, too, are bowing to some big thing. It rattles their stars on the green hill where Percy nurses the hardship of his stitches and walks and walks. There is a dignity to this. There's a formality. The flowers, vivid as bandages, and the man mending. They bow and stand. They suffer such a tax. And the octogenarian loves the little flocks. He is quite blue. The terrible wind tries his breathing. The narcissi look up like children, quickly and whitely.
So I'm reading a poem that I wrote in response to Among the Narcissi, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why I did that. For one thing, I was part of a project called the Plath Poetry Project, and that took place in the April of 2017 into February of 2018. And what the project was doing, the task of the project was to write poems in response to the poems that Plath wrote. There were 67 of them during the last year of her life, in April of 1962 to February of 1963. And so two women had done this together, kind of as a collaboration in response to these poems and a challenge. And it really mined something in their work, and they enjoyed it so much that they made it a public project. And it's still going, so it was happening for me in 17 into 18, it happened into 18 into 19, and now it's in its third iteration as a public project. And so what they did was they put up a calendar every month, and you could see, they would give you links and little prompts, links to Sylvia Plath's poems that she would have written on those days. October was a total killer. I think she wrote 20-something that month. Of 1962. So the project began in April, of 2017 for me. And what you would do is at the end of the month, you could send them some of your poems that you'd written, and they might publish them in an online anthology, in an online journal. And they picked this one I wrote. In April of 2017, my father-in-law suffered a stroke. And he's living, but this poem forced me to write about that, when maybe otherwise I might not have been ready to write about that. So that's really what I want to say about mortality and poets is writing poetry might help us sort of carry on in the face of things, or wrestle or grapple with this thing that we all share as humans, but that it's really hard to wrestle with. And so that prompted me to write about my father-in-law, and I just want to add that I shared it with him because they accepted it for publication. And then I thought, oh shoot, I've got to ask permission of my father-in-law. I had sort of sent it off, and it was the first month of the project, and I didn't really know if they'd say yes, and hadn't really actually considered what to do if they did say yes. And I felt like it was, maybe I should say no to their offer to publish it, because it might be too exposing. And my father-in-law is a taciturn man. He's not necessarily very open, and maybe most of us aren't about our health, but he's really not in general. So this was not an easy phone call, and I called him up and I told him, and I sent him the poem over email. And he said to me, that's just how I've been feeling. Definitely publish it. And it was just this really beautiful opening between the two of us. So the way that I describe in the poem made him feel like I was describing how he'd been feeling, which, meant a lot to me. So my poem is called The Bow, and what I did with Plath, Percy being sick and blue and recovering came into it sort of, but there's also a line, Percy bows and the Narcissi too are bowing to some big thing. So I do have the 3 words, some big thing, in my poem. The bow. We all bow to some big thing. I guess the trick is forgetting how to know that. Once your blood betrays you by bottlenecking on its way to the brain, and the diminutive stroke makes you still the wheel and ask for help, how do you go back to casting the line, far out to sea, only you and whales to the naked eye, and the dashboard sonic pictures of schools showing you the boat's next possible direction, further from shore, heartstrings pulled to the gray matter of them, scattering on the screen? How do you unmoor instead of dropping anchor? For though it isn't in you to sit still, and other men are those who walk the shore in shuffles in their Madras shorts and terry hats, your body has split in two, and the devil you never knew. He haunts your shoulder, waits till you have a fish on the end of your line, and then asks what it was you thought you were doing all this time, pretending you weren't human.
And now do I read?
And now here we are, talking about death and mortality and love, which is what poets are all about all the time. Maxine Kumin became a friend. She was a mentor of mine. I had been an admirer of her poems for a long time. When I was getting ready to come here, I went to reach for the book that had in it the poem that inspired the poem I'm going to read today. And what did I find? But I had 2 copies of the same book, which surprised me because I buy poetry books all the time, but not usually 2 copies of the identical book. And what fell out of one of them was a surprise. It was an invitation to the celebration of her life. And I went to that. The Life and Work of Maxine Kumin. It was Saturday, June 7th, 2014 at 3 p.m. And it was up in Concord, New Hampshire. And I was there, and her husband, Victor, scolded me because I was wearing black. He said, "This is not a funeral. This is a celebration of her life." And that was pretty wonderful. And I met a lot of very interesting people there as well. Poets I knew, poets I had read but had never met, and that was wonderful. She and I had become friends. She read for me in a series I was running down in Princeton, New Jersey. She read for me in another series that I was curating with my friend Hilary Russell, who's over there at Berkshire School in Sheffield. And she then invited me to join a program that she was teaching in at New England College, an MFA program. I didn't need an MFA. I had plenty of degrees already, but I went there because she was teaching there. And I wanted to sit at her feet, and I wanted to learn more from her if I possibly could. And Gerald Stern was there, too, and a lot of other wonderful people, which is how I ended up with this extra degree that I started when I was 75 years old. I didn't need it, but there it was. So this is the poem of hers from that wonderful book. The last book was called "And Short the Season." Allow me, sudden and quiet, surrounded by friends, John Milton's way. But who gets to choose this ordered end? Trim and untattered, loved ones at hand. Allow me that day. Everybody you read an obituary about usually says surrounded by loving family. You know, surrounded by, I don't think, how do they get them all there at once? I don't understand that. And this is mine. Getting to choose, and I use an epigraph from her poem. But who gets to choose this ordered end? Trying to will an ordered end, I'm mucking out the garage, where old manuscripts are stored with books, journals, magazines, old photographs of boyfriends, husbands, friends' kids, mine. My bed and board can't survive this hoard, nor can I abide leaving it to my only child to sort and deal with, short of tossing it all, or calling the junk man and stuffing what remains into garbage bags for shredding, if shredding isn't too dear. But junk won't keep me here. My ordered end will be as sparse as I can make it. The devil take it. And that's how I feel, and that's what I did. And Ben tells me he has a friend who writes about, did the same thing from a male point of view. You there, Ben?
Yes.
Remember that? Yes.
Okay. My beloved William Butler Yeats. Towards the end, like me, I went out to the hazelwood because there was a fire in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor. and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she is gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and walk among the long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
The Year of Reading Yeats by Hildy Weissert. My friend went back to reading Yeats the year she went back to the farm, claiming the land as land, leaving a smart, well-dressed career for dirt. This was her home. She'd planned how what had grown tobacco now would bear a mile below, where grinding, snorting bands of bulldozers pawed the earth and air grew thick, the fruit suburbanites would pay to pick. Her father planned it too, their dream. The pair puttered the rainy fields in a rusty jeep and saw green waves of grass turn blue, the air clear, brushes bloom and vines run deep. But they were only up to planting, bushes bare and squat, when he died, buried on the steep ancestral hill. She went on, day labor like a prayer, and every midnight climbing on the winding stair to Yeats. Yeats, all she read, night in, night out. Is reading only Yeats the same as being mad? Abstract, we feared she'd come to grief, wandering about like Jane or Angus, Gaelic fire in her head. We ransacked our shelves, first Frost, then Wilbur, as the antidote. As beautiful, as deep, but calm. With patient southern tact, she'd smile, wait a week, and hand him back. Devote herself anew to Willie B, taking half of what he wrote by heart. Brown penny to cold heaven, always finding more. We thought she'd left us, abandoned for some acres and a book. But I've reread that year, now see what Yeats' spell was for. Working the same hard ground and finding more was what it took. Stitching intellect to intellect and soul to soul, ancestral form would rise and bloom from rose worked and worked again. Look, children in the fields, berry baskets in their arms. Yeats saved my friend that year, and my friend saved the farm.
Hildy Weiser, The Certainty of Others. And there's a short quote from a Walt Whitman poem first. The certainty of others, the life, love, sight, hearing of others. Others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore. Walt Whitman, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And now Hildy's poem, The Certainty of Others. Soon we are to leave this year and century, a crossing my grandmother made as a young woman, but she was brave, hands eager on the rail, eyes brimming as a new continent wheeled its great machine into view, the New York World copper and rising dome, the new shapes, a skyline. Was there no one she loved in that old wooden land? No one to make her feel that what she left was not behind an ocean, but below. I fear for those who stayed, how they can go on so far from where we rise now on, the new world's turning. And yet, Lower Manhattan is always lovely from the heights. The white choirs my father down from Dartmouth saw in 29. As late as 68, dragging home winter grocery sacks, my roommate caught a glimpse of the Singer Tower and thought it was a Christmas tree on fire. I don't remember when they took the Singer down. It is only Brooklyn and the lesser river, yet standing here, I feel that it is time we look across and that this briny island has sailed us in, the salt wind of a century on our faces. But it is Brooklyn. I see the ferries run again, the white wakes returning home, and behind, it is only a century leaving us.
So finally, we come to end our this very interesting program with Walt Whitman himself and his poem Crossing Brighton Ferry, which has inspired that lovely poem of Hildy's. And Hildy decided she wanted some kind of concerted effort to end because we didn't quite know how to get out unless we all sort of stood up and just wandered away. And so we thought we would try and divide, it's just as an excerpt, the second stanza from Walt Whitman's poem. And so we decided we would divide it up amongst us. And we hope Walt wouldn't be upset. I'm sure he would not, actually. Well, not that man. So Val, you're going to start us off.
And you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. The impalpable substance of me from all the things of all hours of the day, the simple, compact, well-joined scheme, my just self disintegrated, every one disintegrated, yet part of the scheme, the similitudes of the past and those of the future, the glories strung like beads on the smallest heights, and hearing
On the walk, in the street, the passage over the river,
the current rushing so swiftly and swimming with me far away.
The others that are to follow than me, the ties between me and them.
The certainty of others, the life, love, sight, hearing of others.
Others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore.
Others will watch the run of the flood tide.
Others will see the shipping of Manhattan, north and west.
And the heights of Brooklyn to the south and east.
Others will see the islands, large and small.
50 years hence, others will see them as they cross. The sun, half an hour high, 100 years hence, or even so many 100 years hence, others will see them, will enjoy the sunset, the pouring in of the flood tide, the falling back to the sea of the ebb tide. And that's all.